All right, we're live. Welcome back, everybody, to our next to last week class. We are continuing today with our discussion of Ciaphas Cain, Hero of the Imperium. Before we get started with that, however, there's two things I wanted to talk about. The first is that this Friday, the 24th, essay number 2 is due. So that'll be due by 11:59 p.m. And if you are uncertain about what to do for the essay, there is an essay guide under course homepage. Down towards the bottom, I have posted a guide for the essay and for what I am looking for. Um, just to go over it real quickly, it's 1,000 to 1,250 words. I'm not going to punish you for doing more, but if you get to like 10, 20 pages, I might stop reading partway through. But shoot to keep it under, 1,250, 1,500, something like that. At least 1,000 words. And seriously, you can see where it shows up how many words are in the thing. It's really easy to check, and therefore it is easy for me to check on your essays to make sure that you got that. 12 point, Times New Roman, double spaced, 1-inch margins. Include proper citations for all material, even if all you cite is the one essay that you are citing, or not the one essay, the one book that you are investigating. You still need to put in proper citations. I'm less worried about in-text citations if you only have the one source, but you still need a works cited page. And quote everything properly and all that stuff. If you only have the one source, I will assume all quotations are from that source. But yeah. For this assignment, you are asked to choose a hero from our class readings. That's what essay 2 is about. And analyze how the hero is used to comment on the human condition. That is, what is this character trying to teach us? Do not write an essay saying that this character comments on the human condition, because everybody does that. That's not insightful. That's not interesting. Do not write an essay saying this character is a hero, because we can both agree that because this is a class about heroism, you're looking at a character that is somehow heroic. Otherwise, you wouldn't be writing about them. But what does the fact that they are a hero tell us about life? Does it prescribe certain manners of living or a certain worldview? These heroes are things that we are, by nature, inclined to emulate and adore. So what does that suggest? What are we being told to emulate? These are the questions you are answering in your thesis. And I want you to have a clear, straightforward, simple thesis. Simply stated, it is sagacious to eschew obfuscation. Responding to one of these questions. Do not say, the question is, what does this hero have to teach us? This hero has to teach us yada yada. Don't mention the question. That's just amateurish. And I expect y'all at this stage to be better writers than that. So just your thesis is the answer to the question. So this character argues that we should do whatever. Ciaphas Cain argues that we should look out for ourselves, if that's the take you're giving. Now, again, a strong thesis focuses on the prescriptive rather than the descriptive. So again, Ciaphas Cain as an antihero is not very strong or interesting, especially compared to something like Ciaphas Cain argues that typical actions and standards of heroism are foolish. Ciaphas Cain is versus Ciaphas Cain argues. So this is prescriptive. You shouldn't take the standards of heroism. The standards of heroism are foolish. And admittedly, that is a bit descriptive. Heroism is dumb. But you see where this is a stronger stance than just saying he is an anti-hero. He says we shouldn't take these actions, or we should view it this way. This is the worldview we should have. And once you've done that, I also want you to preview your arguments. The standard template that I always recommend is the author uses A, B, and C to argue X. That is, X is what this is about. This is what the author is saying. A, B, and C are how I am going to prove that point. In other words, there is a question. What is this hero teaching us? Your answer to that is your thesis. This hero teaches us that heroism is dumb. How do you know that he's teaching you that heroism is dumb? Well, because of this, this, and this. So a full thesis looks something like this. Through sarcastic internal monologue, cowardly actions, and the adoring reactions of the multitude, Ciaphas Cain argues that the typical actions and standards of heroism are foolish. And yeah, that doesn't mean you can't write a descriptive thesis, but you have to answer the so what. If Ciaphas Cain is an antihero, so what? What does that have to do with anything? Buffy the Vampire Slayer suggests high school is a predatory jungle. And what does that matter? So you have to make that connection. You have to answer that so what? And a prescriptive argument does that more easily because we're talking about influence, and that's an important idea. But it's up to you. And then I have a rubric here. Ignore the title on it. I copied it from another setup, but the basis is the same. So yeah, it's fairly standard. It's fairly straightforward. 20 points for the paper. And these are the kinds of things that I am looking for. Let me answer your question in the chat. Yeah, movies are fine. Movies count as well, but it has to be something that we've talked about in class. So movies or books or comics, those are all good. And feel free to email me with other questions or to ask in the chat. The other thing I wanted to talk about before we get into our course matter for the day is on Friday and on next Monday, we are scheduled to play D&D, Dungeons & Dragons. I've asked for volunteers to play. I'm asking again because nobody has responded to me. And two things. One, you don't need to know how to play. Part of our class on Friday is going to be teaching you the basics, or because I'm assuming that, the number of role players is comparatively small in our class. I'm sure 2 or 3 or 4 people know how to do it, but if you don't, that is not a problem. Part of it is teaching people who don't know what the basics are and how this works. The other thing is to give you a little incentive. I am going to offer 3 bonus points for it to your final grade. That's enough to move your grade from a B+ to an A-. It's enough to shift you from, a letter grade. Not from a B to an A, but yeah, from a B to a B+. So that is an option. It is still first come, first serve, but shoot me an email if you want to do that. My email is 160230@utdallas.edu. It's in our syllabus. No worries. So yeah, shoot me an email if you want to be involved in that. But with that out of the way, let us continue on with our discussion of Ciaphas Cain, hero of the Imperium. And we left off last time with a reminder that we are in a dystopian universe. Thankfully the police restored good order by beating those rebellious teens to within an inch of their life. One Ciaphas Cain novel, he actually mentions a program that people liked on TV called Arbitrator Terror, which is, arbitrator means terror, arbitrator means judge, terror, dread. Nice little joke in there. There are a lot of little jokes like that in the later novels. I think one of the areas is Regio Quintus Unus, which means Area 51 in Dog Latin. Dog Latin being improper Latin, but it sounds like Latin, which is what most of what they use is. All right. So he talks about Divus, and the guy's his old friend from the artillery regiment, who's just really excited about fighting the Tau and really wants to get stuck in. And as usual, he seemed to be relishing the prospect of combat, which is easy to do when you're kilometers behind the front line, chucking shells into the distance, but not so much fun when you're facing an enemy close enough to spit at you. And then there's another point where Divus says something like, "Oh, I wouldn't go up there except with a squadron of hellhounds to cleanse the place." And those are incendiary tanks. And needless to say, he'd never seen what incendiary weapons could do to a man, or wouldn't have been half so keen on the idea. I have, and I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. Well, actually, there are one or two I would wish it on, but that's beside the point. And so we get this. I think it's an interesting contrast between Cain and Divas. Somebody who, and they're both soldiers. Divas is a soldier, but he's in an artillery unit as opposed to a frontline unit. And he's all gung ho and fired up, and we can take him. And the guy who's actually been on the pointy end of it is going, let's not do something so insane. Let's not, start a fight or get in the middle of a war where I'm likely to be shot, stabbed, or killed. And we get this same idea of, he talks a big talk about incendiary weapons, but he's never actually seen one in action, clearly. It's horrifying. And so, is Divas supposed to remind us of Heinlein? Is he supposed to remind us of those types of people, the wannabes, the ones who don't actually see frontline service, but who are all gung-ho about it, and we've got to go take care of them, the armchair generals. And typically, in many ways, the fans of this type of military fiction. I think that was a random email, but I'll double check. Yeah, no. Sorry, hard to tell if it's a chat comment or something else. But yeah, are we supposed to be, is this kind of mocking the typical readership? And I think I asked that question on your reading guide. How much of this is satire? How much of this is parody? How much of it is just straightforward action? And the difference between satire and parody, we've talked about parody. Satire is similar, but it's making a social critique. That's how I divide the two. Satire is about society. It's making fun of society through often humorous, but not necessarily humorous means. Parody is making fun of a genre. It's making fun of genre conventions. And to understand the genre, you have to be, to understand the conventions enough to mock them, you have to be familiar with the genre. And you usually don't get familiar with the genre to that level unless you enjoy it. So it tends to come from a place of love. Not necessarily. I think he's clearly taking the piss out of a lot of the standard 40K hero action stuff. But, it can be a more biting version of parody. But is he making fun of, the readers, basically, the type of people who want to see that hardcore military action with all the fighting and dying and killing and wipe them out from the safety of a armchair with a book where they're in no danger of actually being shot or killed, as opposed to, Cain's perspective where he very much is, regardless of his plot armor. And that's an interesting idea. So a couple of things here about just the Imperium and some little asides. Well, no, not yet. There's a different aside I'm thinking of. But kind of the nature of the Imperium versus the Tau. Cain says, this is where we came in, ready to guide them back into the Imperial fold before they came to too much harm. And all very noble of us, too, I'm sure he'll agree. The trouble is, the hardcore is so far gone, they don't see it that way, says Divas. And then a couple pages later, when they get in the brawl, one of the Xeno lovers, one of the Tau sympathizers says, in a very Braveheartish way, you're here to take our world, but you'll never take our freedom. Your freedom is what we're here to give you, you Xeno-hugging moron. And it's this interesting idea that, you can't fight for freedom, we're fighting for freedom. And we actually see that in the real world. If you've heard of the Christmas miracle from World War I, on Christmas Day, both sides in large patches of the trench line, the Germans and the British laid down their guns, stopped fighting for a day, and went out and exchanged gifts and sang songs and played soccer and all, and actually just treated each other like human beings for a day in the middle of this bloody, nightmarish war. But they actually got in arguments with one another. What do you mean you're fighting for freedom? We're fighting for freedom. You can't fight for freedom. No, you can't be fighting for freedom. We're fighting for freedom. And both sides saying this to one another. And it's, how much of it is just a bunch of pawns being controlled by big government entities that, just pump out the same propaganda. And it's propaganda to both sides. It's meaningless words that both sides are trying to enslave you just to their own ends, and they call it freedom. Just an interesting idea. And then this is where we get that little aside. Well, they claim they're here to safeguard their trading interests, Diva said. We both snorted with laughter at that one. We knew how often the Imperium had said exactly the same thing before launching an all-out invasion of some luckless dirtball. Of course, when we did it, it was true, and it was my job to shoot anyone who thought otherwise. Short. Oh, my typos. Yeesh. So yeah, it was, they're pulling the exact same ploy that we pull. Of course, when we do the ploy, it's, entirely true, and we're not at all being sneaky bastards. And I'm going to shoot anybody who says otherwise because I'm a political officer. But, it's a reminder that our good guys might not be. These are our protagonists, but does that make them good guys? From their perspective, certainly. But, what's the difference between, oh, well, when it's on the enemy side, they're a terrorist. When it's on our side, it's a freedom fighter. So there are, questions there. And I think this is obviously this is intentional. Cain is making these comments because he's, pointing out the follies and the flaws of this gung-ho, let's get them, our country, love it or leave it type mentality. And so it's a very subversive type of book. We get an interesting bit here about his personality when he talks about his parents. And it's one of the few times they come up. Cain mentions being born in a hive city on some planet, and being raised in the Underhive until he was sent to the Scala Progenium, which is like the military school. But it's, as the editor points out, as the Inquisitor points out, it's never really explicitly stated what hive he grew up on, and nobody can ever really figure out. And he says, I know what you are, I said. Kroot killed my parents, and thereby got me dumped in the Scala Progenium and thence into the commissariat, instead of following my undoubted true destiny of running some discreet little house of ill repute for slumming spirers and gilders up from the sump with more money than sense to splash around. I vaguely resented that, far more than the loss of my progenitors, who hadn't been all that much to have around while they were alive, to be honest. But it never hurts to grab the moral high ground. My new acquaintance didn't seem terribly concerned, though. I trust they fought well, he said. I doubted it. They'd only joined the guard to get out of the hive ahead of the Arbites, and would certainly have deserted the first chance they got. So there must be something in genetics after all. And we get this idea that, his parents were just like him. They were as sneaky and underhanded and as self-serving as Cain is. And, it's just luck that he got into the Scala because of them. But, oh well, it doesn't really matter. And then the editorial note on the next page, on page 81. We've got a blank page in the middle there. Says, it is perhaps worth pointing out at this juncture that the account of his background that Cain gives during his conversation with the Kroot, although superficially plausible, doesn't quite hold together on further examination. For one thing, the admittance to the Scala Progenium is a privilege usually reserved for the offspring of officers. If he was indeed the son of common troopers, his parents must have acquitted themselves with singular valor in the action which resulted in their demise, which, to say the least, seems remarkably at odds with his characterization of them. Moreover, he implies that they enlisted and served together. Although mixed units are, as pointed out elsewhere, not unheard of in the Imperial Guard, it would have been extremely unusual for this to have been the case. Cain makes frequent references throughout the archive to having spent his early years on a hive world, but never specifies which one, which in turn makes the verification of any such claims virtually impossible. However, no hive world of which I'm aware raised a mixed guard regiment in the time frame consistent with his narrative. We should also bear in mind that, by his own admission, the man was a pathological liar, giving to say anything he judged would be effective in manipulating his listeners. And it's a reminder, amongst other things, that Cain is very much an unreliable narrator. But I find it interesting that he's an unreliable narrator in his own personal memoirs that he, at least in universe, never expected to go anywhere. And it brings up this interesting idea of, when does the performance end? When does he stop putting on an act and become himself? And are even his own personal memoirs, and therefore basically his own personal memories, are even those a front? Is Cain performing for himself, or performing himself as a fake self, if you get what I'm saying? Are these memoirs a performance that he expects someone to see? And are all memoirs, are all journals or diaries, are they performative? Are you trying to put your best face on in case anybody reads it, or in case you read it yourself? And I don't know, it sparks some interesting questions about the way we engage in our lives and our sense of self versus our the masks we wear, if you understand where I'm going with this. And are we performing our quote unquote true selves as much as we perform in our other roles? And this is very much something that we all do. You act differently as a student than you would act with your friends. You act differently here or at the school than you would at, say, church, if you go to church, or even if you don't, at a funeral. You put on different faces, you take on different roles depending on your situation and what you're trying to get done. How many of you have played, the innocent hurt child so that you can get out of trouble with your parents when you accidentally broke something, for example? And those are performances. And this book is really interesting for letting us get a look at some of the performative aspects from someone who is knowingly doing it and using it to his own ends. And we get a good example of that when he's talking to Colonel Castine and trying to get her pumped up for this formal dinner and reassure her. You are one of the youngest regimental commanders in the entire Guard, a position that, in my opinion, you hold entirely on merit, and my confidence is not lightly earned. It was what she needed to hear, of course. I've always been good at manipulating people. That's one of the reasons I'm so good at my job. And again, it is a class on being manipulative, maybe not lying in this case, because I don't think he is. I think he really regards Castine in a high light. But it's performance. It's telling her what she needs to hear so that she can do her job effectively. And it's manipulating people to a positive end, which I find endlessly fascinating. And like I said, I like viewing this book and the Cain novels in general as kind of a masterclass on being a manipulative bastard to positive ends. Page 88, we get a nice little description of the aristocracy, the governor's palace. Inside, it was exactly as I'd anticipated. The kind of vulgar ostentation too many of the wealthy mistake for good taste, with crystal gilt and garish tapestries of historic battles and smug-looking Primarchs strewn around the place like a pirate's warehouse. The high arched ceiling was supported by pillars artfully carved to mimic the bark of some species of local tree, and my feet sank into the carpet as though it were a swamp. It took me a moment to realize that the weave would form a vast portrait, presumably of the governor himself, if viewed from the upper landing, and I noticed with faint amusement that someone had trodden on a dropped canapé, making it look as though his nose was running. Whether it was a genuine accident or the act of a disgruntled servant, who could say? Castine's lips quirked as she absorbed the full opulence of our surroundings. I take it back, she said quietly. A bordello would have been done out in far better taste. I suppressed a smile as another flunky ushered us forward. Skip a little bit. It was pretty obvious who the unhealthy-looking individual sitting on a raised dais at the end of the room was. I've met a good few planetary governors in my day, and they all tend towards inbred imbecility, but this specimen looked like he should take the prize. He somehow contrived to look both undernourished and flabby at the same time, and his skin was the pallor of a dead fish. Watery eyes of no particular color goggled at us from under a fringe of thinning gray hair. And I think part of this is just a mild satire of the aristocracy, making fun of the nobility as being entirely without good taste, uh, more money than sense, just doing their best to splash around how wealthy and powerful they are, and they're all a bunch of inbred idiots. Which, if you look at British history, at one point, all monarchs in Europe were related to one another right before World War One, late 18, early 1900s, and they were more or less forced to marry into the royalty. So, yeah, they all tended to be inbred. And I'm okay with committing the crime of lèse-majesté. So, yeah, a lot of aristocrats tend to be inbred, tend to be kind of a waste on society. I mean, what do they do aside from cutting ribbons and, making speeches? So I think, again, we have social commentary here making fun of the aristocracy, especially remembering that this comes from a British context where they still do have aristocrats, as opposed to the U.S. where we have robber barons. And then Cain gets ignored in favor of Castine. Well, that was a new experience, being ignored in favor of a slip of a girl. But I suppose if you ever met her, you'd understand it. And so that's an interesting thing to bring up here. And I think this is a continuing theme throughout the novel. How does Cain react to women? Look at how he treats the lounge singer that he ends up dancing with. It's all about her physical beauty and how alluring she is. Likewise with Castine, this reaction is, well, she's definitely good looking. And you'd know that if you'd ever seen her. And that's probably why I was being ignored. And so for all his, treating her with deference, and he does treat Castine well. She is a colonel. She is a regimental commander. But I think there's still this undercurrent of maybe not misogyny, but chauvinism. Kind of, well, I'm the man and I'm in charge, and, why are you ignoring me in favor of some little girl? I'm here to do important military things and woo this beautiful lounge singer with my information and charm. And it's not heavy. It's not like some of the characters we'll see, like, the ones who were in the brawl at the, on the starship. And there are plenty of examples of women being powerful, but I think that's something that Sandy Mitchell, the author, who is male, by the way, I think that's what he's arguing against, kind of that underlying current of, men are the best. In a military maneuver, it should be men doing it. And not even calling it out necessarily front and center, but that is an attitude that exists. And that's an attitude that exists in the Warhammer gaming community. You can't have female space marines because, well, A, a bunch of lore reasons, but B, females have cooties. You can have, battle nuns, that's fine, but they're their own separate thing. And so, not dissimilar to what we saw with Heinlein, with that, yeah, women can be soldiers too, but they're the reason men fight, and they're, a prize to be won. And so I think here we're getting that same tension, but as you will see, it ends up in perhaps a more progressive place, or a more equitable place, if you want to put it that way. So pay attention to the novel's attitudes and Cain's attitudes towards women. As the diplomat tells him, no one here is entirely what they seem, Commissar. You can certainly depend on that. And that is a major theme, duplicity, putting up fronts. Nothing is what it seems. So bear that in mind as we go forward. I'm going to speed up a little bit through some of these. When the bolt pistol goes off, he just dives for cover instinctively. I may not be a paragon of virtue, but I like to think my survival instinct more than makes up for any moral shortcomings I might possess. And is this being cowardly, or is this just being pragmatic? Is this just, smart tactics? Take cover when somebody starts shooting. Or is he a coward justifying it? And again, that's one of those tensions that we have to identify in the novel and have, it's up to you. Again, this is one thing that I find interesting. You know, the governor's declared a state of martial law, I relayed to Denali, who took the news remarkably well, only kicking 2 ornamental bushes to pieces before calming down enough to respond verbally. He would, cretin. It's about as helpful as putting a fire out with promethium, he said. Even I understood the logic of that. The riots on their own were bad enough, but putting several thousand PDF troopers like the ones I'd encountered in the Eagle's Wings onto the streets, itching for an excuse to bust heads, was just asking for trouble. Real quickly, promethium is fuel. It's used as gas, but also used as like napalm. So napalm's angry big brother. But it's this idea, and we see this again and again in this novel, particularly, of not fighting. A big emphasis on when not to fight, which is very, very atypical for 40K. Let me tell you that right off the bat. I mean, look at the image on the cover here. This is a story about fighting, right? About fighting big green things with teeth and winning, damn it, with style and panache. And yet the novel spends a lot of its emphasis on not fighting, avoiding conflict, because conflict is problematic here. And I think that's interesting when we compare it to some of the other books we've read this semester, like Earthsea. In A Wizard of Earthsea, there's this idea of not doing magic. The greatest magic is learning when not to use it, because unless you're very careful, it could have all sorts of complicated after effects. And that's an interesting similarity. And again, this becomes a theme. And again, we get one of the military historian whose stuff gets added on. Small wonder then that ordinary citizens took to the street in their thousands, incensed at the sheer magnitude of their betrayal, armed only with their faith in the emperor and such makeshift weapons as they could lay their hands on to wreak bloody revenge on the traitors in their midst. These are the same idiot rioters that Cain is dealing with and Denali is calling a bunch of morons. The people in the know want nothing to do with this. They think they're a bunch of fools and, they're a problem. Whereas the military historian, looking at it after the fact, is only portraying it as, a righteous populace out for honorable justice and vengeance. And we get a lot of that. And I think that's a solid critique there, a solid satire of military history. And the fact that it's, not actually considering the lives and the difficulties of soldiers and people trying to survive these times. It's all about, glorious battle and heroism and bloody revenge. And it's again that attitude of, they're with us, so they're heroic civilian militia. If they're the enemy, they're a bunch of bloody rioters. And we get that when we see the rioters, both the ones with, Aquilae on them. That's the sign of the Imperium, the double eagle back here that you can kind of see. One head for Terra, one head for Mars. So the Aquilae were common. A bunch of them wearing Imperial symbols are just engaged in rioting and looting. And a bunch of them wearing Xenos stuff are engaged in rioting and looting. And it's not really, it's all about politics. It's about politics. No, it's about being a mob. A mindless, violent group out for whatever they can grab. And so I think, again, that is social satire. And, think of any of the protests that you see of, we've got to do this because of the Republicans or do that because of the Democrats. And it's arguing that at their core, it's basically just an angry mob out for whatever loot it can get. The politics don't matter so much as they are an excuse for violence, which is an interesting take from a military war novel. Or, a military science fiction novel. And we have this interesting look where Cain and his company, or Cain and his soldiers, get stopped by the PDF, the Planetary Defense Force, by basically a bunch of, kind of, for comparison, think of them as the National Guard, or the Reserve, not even the Reserve, but like the National Guard, as opposed to the military. And they're looked down on unanimously by the Imperial Guard because they're a bunch of, I don't know. It's never really explained. They're just not as good or as disciplined or as worthwhile. Um, and one of them refuses to let Cain go by, even though he's got a commissar's authority and has the authority to execute anybody who stands in his way. That's part of what he does. And this idiot just won't listen, and he has to order the execution of the entire PDF squad so that they don't send out any messages, so that they don't betray the fact that these guys are, that Cain and his group are moving through the city. And when I was watching this, or when I was reading this, it struck me, look at this example of glorious combat. The first actual instance of combat we see is a friendly fire incident with somebody who's just a jumped up little idiot. Would this kind of thing ever show up in Heinlein? And I think clearly the answer is no. But I think provides a much more nuanced look at than Heinlein would, or than most Warhammer 40k stuff would. So I think that's where it's coming from. It's adding detail and emphasis to this. And then we get Cain's reaction. I hesitated. I needed to say something now to maintain morale, but for once in my life, my glib tongue had deserted me. Tell them I appreciate what they just did. And that works. And it's an interesting side of Cain losing his manipulative streak, but actually winning the day with just real sincerity and real emotion. So again, it's, sometimes part of being manipulative bastard is letting people see the real you and just being sincere and in the moment and, being human. And that works even better than having the right thing to say at the right time, because it humanizes you and makes people relate to you. And so we get moments of that where Cain is actually sincere and actually a decent person. And so we see hints that exist behind the facade. And we should also remember that comment from the very beginning, from the editor's note before the novel started, that Cain is his own worst critic and often, paints himself as being cowardly or self-serving when he's clearly doing something heroic. So, yeah. Hidden depths to Jurgen. I found his interactions with Lord Zyvan interesting. Zyvan waited until I basically comes in and, oh, well, if I'd known you were going to put out this kind of a spread, I would have been even less late. Just joking with the Lord General, who's someone who not only manages, all of the troops, all of these hundreds of thousands of soldiers on this entire planet and this entire campaign. So he is very, very high militarily, and yet Cain is just joking with him like he's, a regular guy, and going with the rough, blunt soldier act, which he describes, and it works a charm, and ends up, making him a good friend of the general. And we have all these guys saying, we can take him, we can destroy the Tau, we can get him. And Zyvan says, why? We can still throw them out, my Lord General, one of the officers cut in. It would take longer than we anticipated, but we would end up mired in a protracted campaign. Maybe for years, Zyvan cut him off dismissively. And to be blunt, I doubt the planet is worth it. And so we've got these gung-ho generals, kind of like Divas, probably leading from the rear, where admittedly they're going to get a better picture of the tactics and the strategy and the scenario overall. Modern armies generals kind of belong at the rear to manage things, but they're not on the sharp end of things. They're not the ones who are going to be fighting and dying to throw the Tau off the world. They're going to be safe in a headquarters somewhere, as opposed to Zyvan, who actually seems to care for his men, especially not to waste them for this piece of crap world that nobody really cares about. And again, that's an interesting, most 40k novels would be right up there with the, we can still throw them all out. We'll go in and we'll wipe them all out to the last dirty alien, which is what we would normally get in a 40K novel. But here, it's saying, that's dumb, and you're dumb for having that idea. All right. Also on page 127, we get our first instance of Raquel, the Psyker. A Psyker, as I've said, is somebody who has psychic powers and, psychically active. Basically, they can do magic, except it's psychic powers that make magic. But, it's a go-to term for whatever shenanigans and magic-y stuff they need. But once you recognize what's going on, she is really interesting in terms of foreshadowing. And I point this out just literally, it is foreshadowing done well. If you put all the foreshadowing in the mouth of a crazy person, nobody notices. And even if they do notice, they won't pick it up until it's too late. So I find that interesting. The image flickered drunkenly in the air before me, finally steadying into decipherability as Zyvan leaned forward and banged the tabletop hard with a clenched fist. He must have spent considerable time with the tech priest because it functioned perfectly after that, staying sharp and in focus more than half the time. That's a reminder of just the universe in which we are experiencing things, the crapsack world that we have, that their sci-fi, high advanced holographic technology, it's working perfectly when it's in focus more than half the time. That's really not a good standard, which should be obvious. And his mechanical know-how, that's a secret from the tech priests who do all this stuff as a religion. His mechanical know-how is to bang it with his fist. Percussive maintenance. So, yeah, it's a reminder that this sci-fi universe is actually on the decline. It's technologically lost. It is forgotten much more than it knows. And again, it's these nice little reminders and hints of just the dystopian world going on in the background that make this a more fully realized place, I think. Page 138. I take it you approve, Sergeant, I said. One of my most important things I'd found over the years, and which I try to instill in my cadets these days, is that you should always take the time to talk to the troopers as individuals. You'll never make friends of them, except possibly a couple of officers if you're lucky, and you'll never get the job done if you try, but they'll follow you a damn sight more readily if they think you care about them. And what's far more important, at least to me, is that if they start to think of you as one of their own, they'll watch your back when the shooting starts. I've lost count of the number of times one of the grunts around me has taken out a Xeno or a traitor who would have put a round in my back before I'd even noticed them, and I returned the favor too, which is why I'm well into my second century when the graveyards are full of by-the-book commissars who relied on intimidation to get the job done. And yeah, it's, again, how to win friends and influence people through BS. Some comments about the civilians. His heroism when he saves the commissar, or when he saves the Inquisitor, rather. He charges in because a truly horrifying thought struck me. I'd been the one who set the building on fire. If the Inquisition thought I'd been responsible for the death of one of their own, and had just stood by and let him burn without even trying to rescue him, I'd be a dead man, if I was lucky. So yeah, is this heroism, or is this cowardice? And can cowardice lead to heroism? Which is, again, the principles of commissars from, World War II, especially when it was run forward at the enemy, because if you run back, I'll definitely kill you. The enemy might shoot you, I certainly will. So making the men more afraid of you than they are their enemy, and thus leading them towards heroism and courage. Maybe. Were you surprised when it turned out that the Inquisitor was the lounge singer? And why? Why were you surprised? Why did Cain necessarily assume the Inquisitor was a man? And again, this is that idea of gender and the play with gender that happens, and kind of undercutting Cain's assumptions and pointing out, subtly, that he's a bit wrong for his assumptions. He gets fooled. He made himself look silly because he didn't think that he didn't look beyond what was right in front of him. He didn't think this beautiful young girl could be an Inquisitor. So yeah. On page 159 and 160 to basically 159 to 161, we have some interesting ideas, and it talks about the various roles that Commissar Cain takes on, including the modest hero routine. Oh, you've got that one off, Pat, no question. Yeah. What's next? I'm just a humble soldier, or trust me, I'm a servant of the Emperor. I'm not quite sure what you're insinuating, I began, but she cut me off with a chuckle. Ooh, honest indignation. I haven't seen that one in a while. So she sees right through all his tricks, and she calls them roles. And Cain discusses, he does mention, I've been so long hiding behind masks, I was no longer sure there was a genuine Ciaphas Cain underneath them anymore. Just a quivering little bundle of self-interest. And you get this idea of them playing with roles, them putting on masks, metaphorically. And one of the reasons I find this book interesting is because this stuff works. If any of you ever decide to go into the teaching profession, you will start acting as a teacher. I do it myself. I take on the nutty professor role to an extent, and that's the persona I put forward that lets me connect with students and gives me the easiest time of things. If I'm dealing with my bosses, I emphasize the scholarly role of, the scholarship aspect of things, and couch my words in more formal and more typical language. So yeah, there's a lot of power in taking on these roles. Similarly, Amberly does the same thing. And it's interesting when Cain makes a comment, I'd never really had a clear idea of what an Inquisitor was supposed to be like. Although, like most people, I'd had a vague impression of some scary psychopath who slaughtered their way through the Emperor's enemies. Amberly, on the other hand, seemed to be the complete antithesis of this. She had a ruthless streak, of course, as I was to find out during our long association. But back then, the cheerful, slightly whimsical young woman with a strange sense of humor seemed about as far removed from the general preconception of her profession as it was possible to get. And in her note, she says, which was, of course, the whole point. She is doing this intentionally as well. She's putting on a mask to work against the typical Inquisitor stereotype. And again, this sort of thing works, playing against what people expect of you, or playing off of what people expect of you. It's sound advice. And I find that, I just find that interesting. But I like to find advice in literature. That's what I mean when I say heroes teaching us stuff. And again, that idea of pragmatism, it's just a worthless mudball. And as Cain says, it had been an article of, I was astonished. To say that I was astonished would be putting it mildly. It had been an article of faith for as long as I could remember that the sacred domains of His Majesty's Imperium should never be polluted by the alien, no matter the cost. And here was an Inquisitor, no less, and the Lord General himself, apparently quite happy to let the Tau just walk in and have the place. Which, as he notes, is just fine by him, but it's an interesting idea that there's this propaganda that, the Emperor has to have every world, but when it gets down to the actual soldiers and intelligent, leaders who are doing the fighting and dying for it, or who are going to send men to do the fighting and dying, men and women, I should say, that they actually have a strong level of pragmatism. And I think this is a lot different than what we would see in Heinlein. And I think it's different, admittedly, from what we would see in most 40K stories, where, we've got to get rid of them no matter what, because this is our land and this is ours and it has to stay ours. But maybe I'm being unfair to Heinlein and to other 40K stuff. Probably not so much the 40K, because it's big on the gung-ho violent action. Jurgen showing up again. I'd like to go with you, sir. I wouldn't trust any of those frackheads further than I could throw a Bane blade, if you don't mind me saying so. And I'd feel a lot better if you'd let me watch your back. Well, I was touched, and I don't mind admitting it. And this, slovenly, kind of worthless soldier proving himself to be heroic and stolid and dependable. Um, all right. We'll, again, more. I think we can rush through this. Well, sorry, no. We've run out of time there. We'll pick up here on chapter 10 next time. But yeah, hopefully you found that interesting, and hopefully you are enjoying the book. As far as our course discussion, over here in the discussion group, sometime this week, when you finish Ciaphas Cain, let me know your thoughts on it. And that'll be our class discussion for the week. If there are any questions, let me know. Otherwise, shoot me an email if you want the extra credit and want to be involved in the Dungeons and Dragons. I will see you guys on Wednesday. Bye.